Welcome to the final section of today's proceedings and indeed of the week's proceedings. I'm Kieran Brady. I'm the Professor of Early Modern History and Historiography at Trinity College Dublin. And let me say, while Whitney is getting us organised here, that it is an honour for me once again to be back in Columbia, which is one of my favourite universities in the entire world. And it's an honour to be asked to moderate this session. It's also a miracle for me to be here in the first place, because it took me more than 40 minutes to get from the campus to the Hyman Centre this morning. So that I began to feel that it was like one of those CIA pods. You only got to know when you had the code and you pushed the thing that didn't look like a door at all. And my concerns in this regard were deepened when a very kind gentleman whom I asked, for the way, said, "I can't tell you where it is, but I'd have to kill you." And he did tell me where it is, and he hasn't killed me yet, but I'm looking around the corner. However, while I'm still alive, it is my pleasure to open this session, which is to be on religion, capitalism, the rural white working class, religion, capitalism, and race. What more could you ask for? And I think it's very appropriate that an Irish person should be asked to chair these, because concerning religion, first, we know far too much. Concerning capitalism, we know far too little. Concerning race, we don't want to know anything about it at all. But I'm happy to say that our panel of extremely distinguished and prize-winning speakers will enlighten me, and I hope the rest of us, on all of these topics. So let me begin. Jarod is a historian of modern America and visiting associate professor in the Department of History here at Columbia University. He specializes in labor and working class histories of capitalism, with a particular interest in social movements and popular economic thought. He's the author of Spirit of Rebellion, Labor and Religion in the New Cotton South, which is the winner of several prizes, and the co-author of The Gospel of the Working Class, Labor's Southern Prophets in New Deal America, which won no less prizes. Mary Worthen is Assistant Professor of History at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Her research focuses on North American religious and intellectual history, particularly the ideas and culture of conservative life since 1945. Her book, Prophet's Reason, The Crisis of Authority in American Evangelicalism, has been extremely well received. In 2017, she received the Mankin Family Award for Teaching Excellence, and she's also a contributing opinion writer for the New York Times, and has written about religion and politics for the New Yorker and Foreign Policy and other publications. And so this might be a tie-in for us to wrap up all of our proceedings about the influence of op-eds and the influence of things like the New York Times in this era of fake news. Whitney is an award-winning documentary filmmaker and educator. He's been producing and directing films focused on race and identity for almost 2 decades, and is a partner in Two-Tone Productions. Among his editorial credits, he lists Two Towns of Jasper, I Sit Where I Want, and The Legacy of Brown versus the Board of Education. Whitney's current focus, though, is on the Whiteness Project, a story based on interactive media and research project which he is producing in collaboration with the American Documentary and Columbia University's Insight Institute and Veterans Coming Home. It's to be a digital initiative by the Corporation of Public Broadcasting. Whitney's notes here tell me that he teaches interactive storytelling, and I can tell you by way of proof of that, he's also a most entertaining and charming dinner time conversation.
A little too interactive, perhaps.
So with no further ado, I shall ask our first speaker, that is to say, Jarod, to speak to us on make-believe, white workers, and the elusive promise of capitalism.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. It's a pleasure to be invited. What's wrong with the white rural working class? That's what all American liberals want to know. You open up the New York Times, and there the question is, why do they vote against their interests? Why do they act against ideas of mutuality, social security? Why do they act against class identity? Why do they vote for big money capitalists? This question has certainly surged to the fore since 2016, but I'm here to argue that it's not a new question, not a new problem, if we identify it as a problem. Just to put some numbers with that, so in 2016, 658 counties that were rural, predominantly white, meaning over 85% white, and working class voted for Donald Trump. 2 counties that fit that profile voted for Hillary Clinton. Right? So the problem, again, if it's a problem, is certainly stark. Right? The disparity in action is stark, but I would argue it's not new. Those same counties have been voting conservative since the 1980s, and in many cases, since before the 1940s, even back to the beginning of the 20th century. My own home county in the Missouri Ozarks is one of them, so I looked up some statistics that I found. They didn't necessarily dispel my notions about where I come from, but were startling nonetheless. 91% white, median household income 25% below the national median, poverty rate 5 points higher than the national poverty rate, and in 2016, 78.5% of voters voted for Donald Trump. A remarkable figure, but only twice in the past century has my home county voted for a political party that we might identify as liberal or progressive. Twice in 100 years. So the problem has gotten more severe, but the problem itself is not new. And so I think that presents a problem for us as social commentators, as us as thinkers, when we try to understand what's going on. We try to answer the question of what's wrong with the rural working class, the white working class. So many of our responses are contemporaneous, right? Thinking about events of the last 10 years, the last 20 years, in some cases, the last 30 years. I find those arguments insufficient in explaining the historical depth of the pattern. Other explanations, and some of those explanations fit this profile, cultural fear, racial resentment, economic anxiety, all certainly important, particularly in recent years. But these are all negative explanations, right, that don't allow much room for non-reactionary and, dare I say, positive explanations for rural white working class behavior. Right? And I think that as reactive explanations, as a backlash thesis, also do not account for the historical depth of the issue. Now, as a labor historian, I am trained to try to understand people's actions and their beliefs on their own terms, right? Kind of grassroots, bottom-up methodology. And I think that this pattern of rural white conservative behavior makes more sense if we try to apply that methodology to these people. Right? In essence, for me, as a labor historian, to my own people, as distressing. So, just to start a disclaimer, I'm not here to explain yet the 2016 election. I think there's so much we don't know yet. A lot of hot takes all over the place. And as a historian, I feel personally allergic to the hot take. But more importantly, I think the issue is of so much longer historical standing that it needs historical explanation. Or to at least begin to see it as at the end point of a broad set of historical patterns. This issue is not only important to me because it's about where I come from, but it's also what I happen to be studying at the moment. A project I will add that began about 2009, so 7 years pre-mania about this issue, and everyone suddenly got interested in it. And I will anchor this presentation in that research, which explores the history, long history, of white rural industrial workers, in this case metal miners, who consistently resisted unionization and government intervention, particularly government reform, from the 1850s to the 1950s. I'll explain what I found and why I think it's relevant more broadly, particularly after 1950. For now, though, I'll contend that the best answer to our opening question isn't to be found in the realm of pathologies or despair, but rather, and perhaps paradoxically, in expectation. To be specific, white workers, particularly those in rural areas, and especially men, have identified their self-interest in the risk and reward logic of capitalism. An identification that goes back with important disruptions to the 19th century. They haven't been acting against their interests, as many of our current pathologists would say, because at the heart of their interest is a belief, born out in reality, however distant, that capitalism could work for them. Over time, that belief has shaped and been shaped by experiences of race, ideas about nativity, citizenship, and crucially, a risk-taking culture of masculinity. It is often, especially since the 1960s, fed a politics of reaction to perceived threats, but I will argue the belief came before the backlash. And we need to understand the belief before we can understand the backlash. So right now I'm writing a book about metal miners in the tri-state district, a lead and zinc field that crossed the borders of Missouri, Kansas, and Oklahoma, once the leading zinc producer in the world. These miners had a long history of resistance to government reforms and to labor unions. From the first opening of the mines in the 1850s all the way to the 1940s, the vast majority consistently rejected labor unions. They also rejected the public policy measures that labor unions fought for, including laws on safety, the 8-hour day, and public health protections, as well as the New Deal's collective bargaining regime created in the 1930s. Rejected it all. For decades, because of this, they baffled and outraged observers who we might liken to ourselves or our friends, who struggled to understand them, struggled to reform them. So in 1900, union miners called them, quote, bums and thugs, a dangerous class. To a mining engineer in 1910, they were, quote, sullen and violent. A social worker in 1921 found them, quote, almost unapproachable, scared to even talk to them. Quote, with a distinctly hideous outlook that warped their social ideals. They all asked, in one way or another, as we ask now, what was wrong with it? In 1903, one union organizer gave a very simple, succinct explanation that seemed to sum this up. They suffered from a deplorable lack of intelligence. But such dismissive explanations don't get us very far, then or now. I have tried to understand these miners on their own terms, in their own words, and I argue that they rejected the alternatives that other workers embraced, not because they were ignorant, acquiescent, or just bad people, but because they believed in the transformative power of capitalism. Created and adapted a working class culture that valorized its possibilities and acted to realize those possibilities. They did so at great cost to themselves and to their families, as well as unionized miners elsewhere, for decades. From the 1850s to the 1890s, the district was known as, quote, a poor man's camp, where individual prospectors with very little capital could secure speculative leaseholds, becoming the hope being they become their own owner-operator miner, the owner of their own mine. And the possibility of becoming an owner-operator miner on the basis of one's muscle power and appetite for risk attracted thousands of ambitious miners in the years just after the Civil War. At the time, native-born white men were the best place to take advantage of these legal and business arrangements. Many succeeded, some got rich, many more failed. The stories of individual prosperity, however, rooted in hard work, market calculations, physical risk, and over time explain according to supposed racial traits, inspired more newcomers to try their hand. Right? A myth of possibility was created that was rooted and anchored in, at least part, reality. By 1890, as a result, miners in the district saw themselves as working-class entrepreneurs who shared an identity of economic interest with mine owners, whose ranks they expected to join, and little common interest with the growing legions of wage laborers elsewhere, and thus no reason to consider collective action. But just as beliefs impelled action, so action in turn strengthened and elaborated belief. The legacies of the poor man's camp, mental as well as physical, continued to inspire later generations of miners, even after 1900, when deeper mining privileged more capital-intensive methods that gradually installed a permanent system of wage labor, closing off the route of prospecting. They confronted these narrowing opportunities by adapting their older working-class entrepreneurialism into a hyper-masculine nativist ethic of individual acquisitiveness through wage work. First, they learned to exploit this non-union native white status by marketing themselves as strikebreakers throughout the western United States. Wherever the Western Federation of Miners went on strike, miners from the tri-state went to break their strike and earn a lot of money doing so. They understood this over time in terms of native white privilege. Right? They explained in terms of this is what freeborn American white men should be able to do. Go work wherever they want. Not be restrained by a union, particularly a union in the Western Federation of Miners that was predominantly foreign-born. Second, they started thinking of their bodies as capital, to be invested in hazardous, high-paying work. And they did perform brutal labor, many shoveling 40 to 80,000 pounds a day by hand, in exchange for piece rate bonuses by which they could make $5, $6, $7 a day, at a time when Henry Ford was making headlines by offering some workers this $5 a day wage. Here, in this mining district, miners exceeded that, but only through brutal, literally in some cases, backbreaking work. Shoveling 20 to 40 tons a day by hand. Many were injured, and most men soon broke down. But they nevertheless embraced the logic of physical enterprise that glorified the work ethic and bodily power of white Americans, and they put it in those terms, who were crucially non-union and loyal to their employers. If we can't be the operators, one miner concluded in 1915, let's work for the operators if we can, and be satisfied when we obtain good wages. They believed that foreign workers threatened their access to these lucrative but dangerous jobs, and demanded their exclusion. According to another miner, quote, "We have helped to build this mining center, and we are proud of it, and we won't see any foreign trash come here and reap the benefits." That's 1918. These views set them against unions, but also against government reformers, often acting in league with union supporters, who tried to regulate the most dangerous jobs in the mines. Reform became a threat to lucrative, dangerous work. By the 1930s, tri-state miners had created a working-class culture that associated individual economic gain with anti-unionism, aggressive masculinity, and fervent white American nationalism. That culture would live on past the 1950s when the mining in the district finally declined. Locals sought survival and broader attraction in their favorite local son, Mickey Mantle, whose aggressive country boy masculinity captivated white America in the 1950s and 1960s. He worked for a time in one of the mines in the 40s. His father was a miner. What does this case study tell us? I'll go big, right, since we're at the end of the day. I'll be bold. The associations at the heart of these miners' lives of individual risk and market reward, assertive masculinity, and racial and nativist access to jobs with the highest potential pay have broadly defined the worldview of rural white workers since the Jacksonian market revolution in the 1840s. White workers in rural America, whether on farms or in industry, have maintained a durable faith in the promises of capitalism despite remarkable economic transitions and disruptions. That faith has been strongest among those who held a job defined by some level of skill and personal stake in production for the market. I'm talking here about leasehold miners that I'm studying, about one-tractor farmers who produce commodities for sale, skilled tradesmen who often either own their own shops or worked as subcontractors, and later in the 20th century, owner-operator truck drivers, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute. Many historians identify this streak as a generic individualism, but I don't think that's precise enough. I would argue that these workers saw their self-interest not just in some pristine, otherworldly form of individualism, but in competitive individualism defined by market relationships. They sought not freedom from that system, but to gain by it. They all performed their own labor, often with little to no supervision, for their own profit and loss, that key relationship. If we position these workers in sociological terms, and I am by no means a sociologist, we might say upper, lower class with middle class ambition. Right? They have hopes to rise and fears of falling. They stood between the political and economic capital of big business and the unskilled working classes, aspiring to move up, afraid of being pulled down. I would argue that they've been the dark matter of modern American history. We have detected their influence in failed strikes, weak unions, the political vulnerability of the regulatory and welfare state, and the appeal of free enterprise rhetoric. And I would argue that they're the dark matter. We've detected their presence, but we haven't quite named it. Right? We haven't quite brought it into view. And that's what I'm hoping to do in this book. But more specifically, what sustained such hopeful expectations? In part, racial and ethnic advantage supported this belief world. White men had uncommon access to the tools of capitalism. Credit for buying land, tools or equipment, trust for and of employers, first-class rights, and legal standing that people of color, new immigrants, and for most of the period women did not have. They also aspired to be like their economic betters, who are almost always native-born white men themselves. The promise of Jacksonian democracy was that no white man would enjoy special privilege over any other white man, and that as a result, economic mobility was freely open to all white men, what we might call a promise of Jacksonian market revolution. Nowhere do these promises seem more attainable or more necessary than in rural America. As a result, rural white men, that is those living in settlements of less than a few thousand, have always been the most difficult for organized labor to reach. From this perspective, non-white, non-native-born workers, particularly those that arrived after 1800, represented threats from below. They were said to live in worse conditions, eat worse food, and crucially accept lower wages, risk undercutting the native white American male wage expectation. In some cases, like Western metal mining, they were said to import foreign radical ideologies that threatened Jacksonian capitalism. Nearly everywhere, white workers distrusted them, developed hatreds for them, called for their expulsion and or exclusion. And at no time have large numbers of working class white men entered freely into alliances with people they deemed not white. It's important to understand, however, that while access to capitalism was privileged, the outcome was not, and certainly not foreordained. What we often call the American dream obscures the risks and dangers that aspiring owner-operators and petty producers had to assume. The miners I studied called their leasehold contracts jug handles. If you can picture a moonshine jug, it's got one handle on one side, and they said that it was a jug handle because the risk was all on one side, theirs. They're holding the jug handle. Those risks were financial as well as physical, whether for leasehold miners, farmers, and more recently owner-operator truck drivers who invested capital, often through debt, in their own businesses. To succeed, they not only had to possess the requisite skill and market knowledge, but also strength, endurance, and courage. As Harley Hochschild's recent book on the right shows, a valorization of risk and its upsides and a devaluation of caution pervades rhetoric about business, work, and capitalism among conservatives, especially conservative men, emphasizing the upsides of risk, de-emphasizing its downside. The physical embodiment of risk and reward fashioned a new ideal of reckless masculinity, I would argue, that has provided crucial cultural support for rural working class beliefs in capitalism. So it's definitely the case for the self-employed, but also for those who worked for wages. The latter expected high wages for, quote, hard work, and came to glorify, quote, working hard. That is, displays of endurance and strength and a lack of concern for safety. This ideal encourages identification with the job and its rigors, loyalty to employers, and even to an industry. I would argue that we see this in contemporary identifications with coal, right, as an industry, among actual coal miners, not fat guys with coal mining hats on. The actual work, then, of these beliefs acted upon matters, and I would argue almost like ritual, right, in sustaining a belief in capitalism. I think it's at the heart of working class country culture today. Pickups, work boots, camo, Carhartt. Truck drivers, in particular in the 20th century, shaped and defined this image of risk and reward masculinity. I think of Humphrey Bogart in the film They Drive by Night, or Chris Christopherson in Convoy. I've got a visual aid of the movie poster for Chris Christopherson in Convoy, 1978, just to demonstrate what I'm talking about. As one truck driver said in 1975, quote, "We have this Paul Bunyan or something like that image about ourselves." It's this rugged masculinity that's become the central means by which white male workers understand the relationship to family, society, and work itself. Only a very few notable political movements with powerful alternative movement cultures have ever displaced or disrupted this rough, self-interested heroism. Populism, socialism, and among a very, very few, communism. Occasionally organized labor tempered it, although less successfully in rural areas, and always limited in very revealing ways. The American Federation of Labor did best because it emphasized cooperation with management, limited its demands to pay, grievance procedures, and in short, looked to get the best deals possible within capitalism, not to undo capitalism. They did so, however, by limiting organizing to skilled white workers, mostly men, and by strenuously working for immigration restriction, which they helped to achieve in 1924, the most restrictive immigration law in American history. The AFL, simply put, pandered to racism and nativism of white men for decades. Even the signature labor protections of the New Deal reflected their priorities. One gained access to these benefits only through remunerative labor. Government benefits not secured by work became stigmatized as welfare. And indeed, the first version of Social Security in 1935 didn't even have any dependent benefits. Those were added in 1939. The Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, which limited the work week, established a federal minimum wage, also created set overtime pay at time and a half. The overtime bonus over time became an incentive for overwork, right? To earn a bonus for working too much, for risking your body more through endurance, often sleeplessness, and remains one of the most important ways workers have of of gaining bonus pay, right? It's through overwork, physical risk. After the war, of World War II, federal government even financed these ambitions with GI Bill loans to start small businesses. Many men used the money to start owner-operator trucking outfits. A lot of them were former miners in the Tri-State District. It is now a regional independent trucking hub. There are literally dozens of independent trucking companies in the area. And of course, all of these federal provisions affirmatively privilege white men over women and people of color. AFL unions only awkwardly and painfully started to welcome African Americans and women in the late 1960s. Then, so the unions kind of hold this in check a little bit, but by pandering to its kind of core beliefs. Then in the 1970s, at a moment of capitalist crisis, when perhaps a new political movement with more ambitious movement culture might have changed things, political allies and enemies of unions began to remove their support for the union movement. 1978, the Carter administration badly botched a labor reform bill that would have made it easier to organize. And then after 1980, the Reagan administration systematically stripped federal protections for union organizing and started a process of decline in private sector unionism that has not stopped to this day. At the same time, Republicans started appealing to the forces of capitalist aspirations that unions had sort of held in check in the middle of the 20th century, and offered new but old explanations for why those aspirations had been thwarted. Big government, regulation, corrupt union bosses. They added appeals to religion and race. As union jobs and good paying non-union jobs dwindled in the 1980s and afterward, working class white men continued to believe in a self-interested, risk-taking masculinity that's beholden to no one. Here, conservative claims that the promise of capitalism had been thwarted by enemies, domestic and foreign, found fertile ground. It's easier to understand why white workers found this convincing, continue to find it convincing, if we recognize that they already believed in its fundamental premises and core claims. That capitalism will work, that growth will return, and they will benefit. That risk and hard work are the ways to do this. With no strong alternative belief world to challenge this, their expectations have been robust, even without new evidence to support them. So to conclude, if we want to start to understand the politics of rural white working class men today, look at the kind of jobs they do. You'll find truck drivers, many of them independent operators, tradesmen and contractors and subcontractors, and also factory workers who covet overtime. My own father works 60 to 80 hours a week, precisely to earn the overtime pay. You might be surprised that the nation's highest rates of entrepreneurship are in rural areas. Places with less than 2,500 residents in 2010 led the nation with 234 owner-operator businesses per 1,000 residents. Right? The highest rate by far in the United States is in rural areas with fewer than settlements of fewer than 2,500 residents. Now, a lot of that's farming, but even the cell phone rate for non-farm businesses is higher than in big towns or urban areas. Their world is one primarily of physical hazards, the possibility but not guarantee of commensurate rewards. They understand that gamble in racial and gender terms. To confront those hazards is what it means to them to be a white working class man, an American man in some iteration. What women think about this, frankly, we know a lot less. We know women's voting patterns are white working class rural women's voting patterns are less conservative than male counterparts, but we don't know much about how they view the social risks of this kind of wide open aggressive masculinity. And so we often pose the question, why do white workers act against their interests? I think the question is wrong. For many, this is how they see their interests. This is what they believe is true. Thank you.
Thank you, Jarod, for a very very thought-provoking paper. The title of our next presentation, I think, is no less thought-provoking. It's Theologies of Evangelical Trumpism.
I hope you all don't mind if I stand. I have an old hip injury that starts to act up from sitting all day. So this is how I'll do it, and I'll project. I think that, I'm not casting a funny shadow, am I? No. All right. I think any successful politician wins votes because he or she tells voters a story that they want to hear, a story that lines up with what they may already think about who they are, what their country stands for, and so forth. And I think that Donald Trump masterfully played on and reinforced a number of stories that white evangelical Americans like to believe, have believed for a long time. And I'm going to focus on three of them. The first is a story about the role of government, particularly as it pertains to religious liberty. The second is a story about women and authority. And the third is a story about experts and how we discern truth. And I'm going to take these stories in order. And I should warn you that this is going to involve a fairly deep dive into theology. And by dwelling on theology, I want to emphasize that I am not diminishing the importance of less intellectual explanations for our political situation, like nativism, racism, economic resentment. But I think for many, theology, ideology generally, it becomes a set of powerful frameworks that help precognitive motivations coalesce and make sense to people, have a certain logic, and that's why they're important to pay attention to. So first let me take this matter of the role of government, because I think this is a substantial feature of evangelical political ideology that has gone sort of misunderstood by many secular observers for a long time, well before Trump. And I should stress at the outset here that I'm really using evangelical as primarily a white term. In my experience as a journalist, whenever I have occasion to interview a conservative Protestant who's Latino or African American, it's very rare that they want me to call them an evangelical. It really has a white tag, and that's how I'm using the term now. So, in the Gospels, Jesus seems to have a lot of concern for the poor, and to most liberals, secular and Christian, this seems like it ought to translate into evangelicals supporting a more generous social safety net, public welfare, and so forth. And of course we know that many evangelicals, although of course not all, reject that approach to the role of government in people's lives, even as Jarod notes, when loads of them might stand to benefit quite substantially from that sort of intervention. They opt for what I'll call a selective libertarianism. And that is a hostile view of the social safety net, but a worldview that is not really small government in some of its most important features. I mean, they love Donald Trump's promises to intervene quite aggressively on a number of policy issues, immigration being an obvious one. And I think to understand this, we actually need to go back at least to the 18th century, to the time of the American Revolution, when many evangelicals came to think that the Bible called them to political rebellion against a strong government. When I talk to my undergraduates about this, I love to use the example of the great Baptist preacher Isaac Backus. And this guy became one of the great evangelists of the revolutionary cause. In 1775, shortly after the battles of Lexington and Concord, he gave this passionate sermon on the ridiculous doctrine of passive obedience to the king, and calling on Christians to rise up in violent resistance as Christians. Backus is interesting for us because he represents this crucial moment in American religious and political history when American evangelicalism became fused to late 18th century Republican politics, Republican small r politics, when the language of individual, free, uncoerced conversion to Christ became married in a powerful way to the language of independence, freedom from civil tyranny. When really these two ideas of freedom merge, and the dominant religious tradition in America became entwined with this powerful suspicion of centralized government. Now, historically, evangelicals have sometimes been more than happy to use the tools of government to enforce a certain moral vision or support their own cultural authority. Think about things like the campaign for prohibition. So this American evangelical suspicion of centralized government, if it might threaten Christian liberty, has always been sort of combined with this taste for mobilizing the tools of government when necessary to police morality or to maintain their cultural authority. And this mix of libertarianism and coercion, this ideological flexibility, I mean, it really originates before Isaac Bacchus with his own 17th century Puritan forebears, the settlers of Massachusetts, who really found this combination crucial to building and maintaining their city on a hill. Now, it is absolutely true that within evangelicalism there have been other competing visions of state power, and Jarod has written at length on some of them, the socialist Pentecostals and other good examples. But I really think that if you want to understand today's fights over tax policy, over Obamacare, you have got to go back to the Revolution, if not all the way to the Puritans, to the roots of this sort of this selective libertarianism, this idea among evangelicals that Christians could not be free to completely obey the Bible, obey their own conscience, without placing strong limits on the powers of the state. The other giant piece of this is race, of course. Evangelicals have been maybe particularly disinclined to support major efforts in Washington to redistribute wealth or otherwise fundamentally address structural injustice, especially if it means giving tax dollars to people who do not look like them, immigrants or non-whites. And I would say that this last problem, the problem of cultivating empathy in a diverse community, is a universal human problem. I don't see it as unique to evangelicals, and it's particularly pronounced in this country because of the legacy of race-based chattel slavery. Recently, historians like Jefferson Cowie have also pointed out that the heyday of government social spending and expansion of the safety net coincides almost exactly with our period of greatest restriction on immigration. Jarod mentioned the beginning of that period, 1924, the Johnson-Reed Act, which virtually extinguished immigration from everywhere but Western and Northern Europe, up until 1965, when the Hart-Celler Act lifted those quotas substantially. And it is not a coincidence that that's the period of the New Deal and the Great Society. But let me pick up and keep following that theological thread. This idea that the individual Christian conscience and its work in the church is really the most sacred matter. I mean, these are the elements of society that the government should protect above all. I think to understand the current debate over religious liberty under Trump, we have to add another piece to this narrative I'm trying to sketch, the late 20th century chapter of this story. So, in the early 1970s, Christian right was not yet the political juggernaut it would become. Jerry Falwell Sr. was still a fundamentalist who wasn't quite sure the Gospels permitted full-on political activism. But then Paul Weyrich, who was an Eastern Rite Catholic from Wisconsin and a very savvy political operator, who had been trying to organize conservative Christians since the Goldwater campaign, really struck political gold when the IRS revoked the tax exemption of Christian white-only private schools, known to their critics as the segregation academies. So these were private Christian schools which were de facto all white, that some evangelicals, including Jerry Falwell, had set up in response to efforts to desegregate their local public schools. Now, evangelicals swore up and down that this was not about race, this was about their right to educate their children according to their faith. And they felt victimized by court decisions, by government regulations that policed their private schools. And it was really the call to defend evangelical religious liberty in this situation. It was not, at least not initially, the legalization of abortion that summoned white evangelicals in large numbers to serious grassroots organized political action. So this is really the origin point of kind of the modern Christian right. Now those evangelicals who use this language of religious liberty today typically try to ignore this pretty ugly chapter in their community's history. And some of them, I will note, have a pretty decent record on matters of race and civil rights. But the fact is that these Christians are using an argument that their predecessors used to defend segregation. And they're using it, of course, to defend prejudicial action against homosexuality. Evangelicals reject that analogy entirely, and strictly from the standpoint of scriptural warrants, from the standpoint of what the Bible actually says. It's true that the issues are not identical at all, but it seems to me that proof texts don't particularly matter, beyond the bounds of the church, and especially as mainstream opinion is quickly coming to really equate prejudice against non-heterosexual people with racism from a moral point of view. I think the ability of conservative churches to continue to ban queer people from roles in their churches or other aspects of their institutional life will hinge on whether they can persuade mainstream opinion, not to mention the courts, that the analogy here is not to race-based discrimination. The analogy is to discrimination against women, which evangelical institutions continue to practice in all sorts of theologically substantiated ways, with, it must be said, a fair amount of support, even among non-evangelical women. And certainly there's loads of evangelical women in these communities who are absolutely adamant in their support for these rules against whether they can serve as pastors and so forth. Now that's eroding somewhat. I think over the long durée, we're absolutely seeing women take on more roles. But it's not something that's provoking a lot of liberal outrage. I think for that to happen, though, it's going to require a number of LGBT evangelicals to come forward and say, this is what we prefer. This is the role we want to play, for that analogy to work. Okay, now I'm in the realm of sexuality, so let me turn to white evangelical attitudes toward women and authority. The first thing to note here is that for as long as anyone has been keeping track of things like church attendance, women have made up the majority of churchgoers, members of religious communities generally. It's not just a Christian thing. And for almost that long, so for say the past couple hundred years, church leaders have been worried about the so-called feminization of the church, the absence of men, the emasculation of muscular Christianity. This is a very old theme. Now, if you go into the church archives and you follow the arguments about things like whether female missionaries should be allowed to preach, whether women can serve as deacons or ministers, you'll run into the same Bible verses over and over. St. Paul's prescriptions against women speaking up and so forth in the Bible. And you will find an assertion that believing in the inerrant authority of the Bible, believing in the doctrine of biblical inerrancy, requires adhering to these very strict gender roles across all times and places. Now, I think initially this seems like sort of an obvious point. Of course, conservative evangelicals are insisting that Paul's rules about women should apply for all time. Of course, they think that the Bible is perfect with absolutely no mistakes in it. What's new? Well, the truth is that this idea of the inerrancy of Scripture, as many activists in the Christian right understand it, has a more recent origin. I'm not going to go into the details of it, but I'll just say that it has a pretty clear intellectual lineage that goes back to the mid-17th century, to a particular set of fights that Protestant theologians, particularly in the Reformed tradition, were having with Catholic scholastic thinkers and secular intellectuals of their day, people, Enlightenment philosophers, scientists who were trying to debunk Christ's miracles, that sort of thing. And what emerged was this really rationalistic way of thinking about the authority of the Bible, very, very much preoccupied with kind of logical syllogisms and really seeing the Bible's authority as a kind of scientific authority, and emphasizing that the Bible is totally changeless and without error, and kind of part science textbook. But what's important to know is that that view of the authority of the Bible has never spoken for all conservative Protestants. Historically, evangelicals have had a range of ways of thinking about the Bible's authority. And I'll just mention one, because it's important for the stuff about women. And that's the Wesleyan tradition, so the one that we associate with John Wesley, that gives us Methodism and the Nazarene churches and so forth. The Wesleyan tradition historically has instructed believers to think of Christ himself, rather than the Bible, as God's main revelation. I mean, Christ is the Logos. Christ is the most important thing. And they ought to read the Bible with the aid of human reason, church tradition, and personal experience. It can be this sort of more balanced approach. Wesleyans also have what we can call a more perfectionist narrative of God's work in the world. A viewpoint that hopes for humanity to get better at imitating Christ over time, so that perhaps the rules that God set up for the first century don't need to apply for all time as we sort of get better at these things. However, think about the broader context of American culture and intellectual life at the turn of the 20th century. Think of the cliches, right? Headlines are rising, women are demanding the vote, millions of non-Protestant, even non-Christian immigrants are flooding into these noisy, dirty cities. Some Protestants are adjusting their view of how you should read the Bible to accommodate new science, all the precursors of today's culture wars. The defense of an errorless Bible that could answer science on its own terms, that could protect man's authority over women in the home, this really began to appeal to a wide array of conservative Protestants who felt that their control over American culture was in danger. So this idea of biblical inerrancy, of the perfect Bible, it became kind of the fundamentalist battle cry, a symbol for the Bible's authority over modern life. Now there's another problem also. I told you that there are these conservative Protestant resources for a theology of gender equality. But as far as I know, there are not any good proof texts or theological traditions for explaining away the decline of white male authority in modern America. Now, of course, there are absolutely ways to draw on theology to talk about economic haves and have-nots, particularly the tradition of the social gospel and its meditations on institutionalized, collectivized sin. But that view tends to be at odds with that impulse of selective libertarianism that I mentioned. And I really think that the masculinity piece is so important here. The long history of evangelical anxiety about Christian masculinity, the assertion that Jesus was manly, he was not meek and mild. I think this seems to only make evangelical men feel more like failures, and they just don't have a good way to account for their sense of diminishment theologically. And here, I think, is where we can start to understand these mysterious evangelical women who also voted for Trump. Because these two trends in modern society, right, the ascending status of women the declining status of men, they are intertwined in the same families. And in a family where the man is no longer the breadwinner, he can no longer aspire to the status that his father or his grandfather had, where the women in his life have seen him fall away from Sunday worship with the congregation, perhaps we can start to understand the constant appeal of this more hierarchical theology of gender and the perverse appeal of Trump's pseudo-masculine performances. I want to say a word about the third and last story, and that's a story about experts and fake news. Because so often, Donald Trump doesn't start with an ideological point, right? He starts with an alternative reality that he's proposing that you have to buy into for anything else to work. Now, I told you that evangelicals have this long history of challenging secular experts when it comes to the authority of the Bible, theory of evolution, this sort of thing. But for a long time, evangelicals were still really concerned to prove the truth of Christianity through an appeal to evidence out there in the world, what is called natural theology, making the case for God's authority by pointing to evidence that you can access regardless of your metaphysical beliefs. Around the turn of the 20th century, something interesting happens in the intellectual history here. A Dutch theologian named Abraham Kuyper shifted the focus a bit away from this project of using evidence out in the world toward really a preoccupation with the foundational assumptions that make a Christian worldview different from any other worldview. So he started to change the terms on which Orthodox Christians argued with non-Christians. And this kind of shift in framework really came into full bloom some years later in the American context, between the 30s and the 60s, thanks to the work of a couple of key theologians, particularly at Westminster Theological Seminary outside of Philadelphia. And they developed a school of thought known as presuppositionalism, which is a mouthful, but the basic idea is very simple. And that's simply that you've got to recognize the assumptions that frame your worldview. And you can only access reality accurately if proceeding from the correct assumptions. The main one being you accept the truth of the inerrant Bible. Now what this does in the context of an argument with an opponent you don't agree with is that if you can say that the assumptions of your opponent's worldview are wrong, you don't have to look at any of their evidence. Voila, you can call it fake news. In my last book, I spent a lot of time tracing the influence of this particular theological tradition on a number of the key culture warriors who really helped launch the modern Christian right, who taught modern evangelicals to talk in terms of the Christian worldview versus the secular humanist worldview. So my point is simply that when Donald Trump started to talk in terms of phony news and fake news, he unwittingly capitalized on two generations of evangelical intellectual practice. They were already doing this. Okay, so I've given you three frameworks: the business about selective libertarianism, women in authority, and this history of presuppositionalist theology that I think help account for how evangelicals so quickly came to embrace Trump as he sort of played on them and helped fuse them with these more inchoate sources we've talked about, nativism and economic resentment. And I look forward to hearing more about all of that in Whitney's paper. Thank you.
There's your cue, moving right along.
Let me see if I can get this to...
And Whitney's paper is entitled The Whiteness Project.
Is it this one?
Okay.
This one? Yes. Oh, wow. It worked. That's the hardest part of my job is getting technology to work. You know, I'm the last speaker of the last day of this thing, and so, I felt like a lot of pressure here to sort of actually cut to the chase. But I also, sitting here, I also feel like a bit of a fish out of water. I've met scholars from Ireland and PhDs and MAs and BSs, and I'm just a filmmaker. I'm not an academic, and I'm not an expert on anything but myself. And so I was thinking, as a filmmaker, we've heard a lot of data, we've seen a lot of things, but I wanted to tell a story. And tell a story both about where I've come, where I'm going, and a little bit of what I've learned along the way. And when I was 14 years old, I was a counselor at a YMCA in Boston, and this is in the 70s. During there was busing, there was a lot of tension. And most of the kids that were my kids that were the campers were Black or Puerto Rican. And one day we decided to go swimming in the North End of Boston. And we got on the subway, and I took them down, and they all jumped the turnstile, and we went out there. And as we went into the changing room, and all of a sudden we're surrounded by a group of white men. They seemed like they were 50. They were probably 18 or 19. And they said, if these kids go in the pool, someone's going to get seriously hurt. You have to take them out of here. But they didn't use the word kids. And at 14, I then had to try to explain to the kids what had happened in that situation, what was going on. And in that moment, I realized I didn't have a language to discuss it. And it also was totally disorienting. It was a disorienting moment in my community as someone, I felt I was in my community. My grandfather was Italian. He lived in the North End. He was like the king of Little Italy. And here I was suddenly alienated from my own community. Fast forward about 20 years. Maybe about 15 years. I'm in being, as you can see, like a good white, waspy New Englander. We spend the summers on Nantucket. We go up in Cambridge. And my sister asked me to pick up her friend at the airport. Shayla, whatever her name was. And she said, go pick her up. She's about 5'8". She has brown hair. She's a little overweight. And I went to the bar, and I look around. I don't see her. And I said, I don't see this person. And she said, no, she's there. She called me. She's at the airport. I'm looking around. Now, you know the end of the story, right? Of course she's there, but she's blind. And I don't see her because my sister didn't tell me. And that gave me suddenly a disorienting relationship to myself. Somebody who grew up in a very liberal family, had worked in film, did a lot of social justice pieces, and really kind of feeling like, well, what does this say about myself that I can't look at somebody and identify them as a person without some sort of marker? Now, the third story is a little more complicated to get to. I made a film in 1998 with my producing partner, Marco Williams, who's African American. And we made a film about the murder of James Byrd Jr., who was chained to the back of a pickup truck in 1998 by 3 local white men and dragged to his death. And the way we made the film is that I lived in the white side of the community with a white film crew. He lived in the black side of the community with a black film crew. And we filmed the entire trial process, and nobody knew we were working together. We just sat in their own communities, and then we tried to come together. When we came together, we realized that despite the fact we'd gone to the same high school, known each other at 14, despite the fact that we both went to similar schools, he went to Harvard, I lived in Cambridge, he lived in my house as a high school when he was in college. Despite the fact we're both filmmakers, we couldn't agree on reality. The events were taking place that were so complex in this community that the black community and the white community, what he was filming, despite filming the same thing, it wasn't the same thing. And I had this very unique experience of being in a situation of having shared control, where normally you have total control or no control. We had a compact that we would agree on everything. And it was the most brutal editorial process to cut the film. Now, the film came out, it did pretty well, so it put me on this point where we were giving a lot of talks about it and going around, and one event was structured by a group called Facing History and Ourselves, and they structured being interviewed by a group of 7th graders. And during the course of this interview, of this panel of students, one of them said to me, this young girl said to me, Whitney, what have you learned about your racial identity working with Marco and all these projects? At that point, we'd made a bunch of films together. And I had another disorienting moment where I realized that in that split second despite the fact that I'd made a number of films on race, despite the fact that I'd lectured widely on it, despite the fact that I'd written curriculums about it, I'd never fundamentally understood how my own race was an active, dynamic component that was impacting every moment of every day. And it was kind of this sort of like taking of the red pill moment, where suddenly I could see the world differently. This simple question by this young girl transformed everything in my life, where I just started to be able to see all my interactions were different, all my interactions were changed. Now, being a filmmaker, my first thought was, well, how can I monetize this? How can I make a film out of it? Because that's usually so I went out, I tried to make a film, and I started, and when you make a film, and you tell stories, you know, most of you are writers, you're looking for representational things to tell stories about. And I found very quickly going out, and especially film is like a horrible medium for specific information. And I kept finding that the stories I was trying to tell about whiteness, whether it was filming a school and filming, you know, a bake sale where like the different prices for the white students or the black students, or whether it was at the Young Republicans Club putting up their whites-only scholarships, it became so, the needs of narrative are so, narrative is sort of this horrible thing that destroys everything interesting about film products. So this sort of need of driving the story forward takes away everything that's interesting. So I just started to interview white people and sit down and start talking to white people. And I just started in my living room, bringing people in and asking very simple questions. What makes you white? You know, what are the benefits you get from being white? What are the drawbacks you get from being white? Are you happy you're white? And I realized in seeing it unfold on camera, I started realizing that most white people had never actually investigated those questions about themselves. They investigate systems, they especially liberal whites were really interested in structural racism and finding prescriptions for problems, but they actually hadn't explored the relationship of how their race impacted their lives. And so I said, well, this is great. I've been funded by lots of people, and I said, I have this great idea. It's called For Whites Only. It's going to be about white people, and I got every door slammed in my face. This was about 7 years ago. It was clearly not a good idea at that point. So I went back, and I ran into someone from POV, who of course was a Pakistani immigrant American, who was like, what happened to the Whiteness Project? And I said, well, I didn't get it funded. And he said, I'll fund it. And I said, well, that's great. And I said, here's my $400,000 proposal, or whatever it was. And he said, that's good, I have $10,000. So, what can you do? And I said, well, I'll make something to prove to the funders they're wrong. And Daryl, you'll appreciate this. I went to Buffalo, New York, and I found a group of horror film producers. And they were the only ones who would work for so cheaply. And they said, we love this idea. We're going to talk to white people. Just give us a stack of Tim Hortons gift cards, and we'll fill your studio. And so they went out with their stack of Tim Hortons $10 gift cards. It wasn't like $20. It was $10, you know? And they went out and they went into bars and restaurants and into garages, and they just asked people to come in and talk about being white. And I didn't really know what I was doing. And so this is what we got here. Let's see if I can get this to work. So I talked to 24 people, and I was really interested in the conversations that we had about how they saw themselves and they saw the world. Now, I thought that I'd start with Ronald, just because everybody's been talking about the Trump voter, but nobody has let him talk. So I thought that maybe this would be a good place to start.
many people that aren't proud that they're white, not in my social group. Most guys in my social group, they don't say they're Italian or Polish. They might be from a Polish or Italian or Irish background, but they know they're white, and they kind of, just portray themselves as white people, Owning a bar, I'm involved with 25 to 40 different people every day. We have these discussions, especially after a few cocktails. You really get into talking, and a lot of it might be baloney, but we still, a lot of things come out in the open, and I thought, well, maybe I should go down there and speak up. I think affirmative action was nice. It had its time. I think the time is over with. We're going to keep this up for another 150 years. Oh, we got to have so many Asians in the fire department. We got to have so many blacks in the fire department. We got to have so many Latinos. The white guys will never have a chance to be a fireman or a cop anymore. We had that problem here in Buffalo, affirmative action, where they had to hire so many blacks on the fire department and the police department, so they were being hired over white males, So what happens, the white males took it to court, and finally the New York State Supreme Court ruled that, hey, these guys scored better, they did better on the agility test, the mental test, the whole thing. They should have been given the jobs, but you gave it to minorities instead, and they won their case. A lot of minorities should understand that a lot of white boys aren't going to be pushed around, It seems that the younger generation of white males are a little bit more fearful of minorities, They don't want to step on anybody's toes. Everything has to be politically correct. I wasn't raised that way.
So what I did is I talked to, I'm always wary of showing these pieces because any one out of context is not great. Ronald is one person in 24 people, which I think is pretty representational. And so I didn't just go out and get the people to say the most horrific things. This was a selection I tried to select. As I said, I'm not a scientist. I basically tried to select people that was a good range of ages. I also, in my initial thought process, I was really thinking about white monolithically. And as opposed to a more complex structure of whiteness and how it fit into an equation. The other thing you see is there was data. And what we did is after each interview, I'd find something that was kind of what I thought representational of something, and then I would do a data study to find the data point. And I thought it was you can go and you can find the data for all the studies that are represented, because I really wanted it to be transparent. Now, one of the things that happens, I'll talk a little bit more about, is one of the things I found when I started looking for data is there's not a lot of data on white people. And that there's a lot of data on race that you can reverse engineer stuff from. There's a lot of sense information, but the actual how whiteness construction lived and the belief system hadn't really been studied. And so I felt a little bit like I was thumbing the scale of what I was doing because I'd have to reverse engineer things that I wanted to get. So anyway, the project went out, and you can go, if you're interested, you can go on the website and you can watch some of the other videos. I don't want to take up all the time with those videos, so there's a lot of things. And I want to get some other videos in it. And what happened is I put it up, and the response was, I put it online, and it went up in 2014 in October, and it just erupted in this way. And you could track it through social media, track it through different platforms, and millions of views. And it was really interesting about it is it was every country in the world was watching it. So there was this. If I was wanting to put this, but this doesn't work. This piece of it. So slide this so I thought I could put that on it. Try to navigate the technology. Anyway, so I can't seem to get that slide to come up on the screen, but I just looked in the last month. It's still, I haven't updated the thing in about a year and a half, and it's still, there's probably 6,000 people come and watch 30 or 40,000 videos every month on it. And I'm seeing that what I'm actually seeing from tracking the analytics, that the website is actually become, I started getting all this feedback from universities. The Mayo Clinic is using it to train trade cultural competency in doctors. It was being used in schools by diversity trainers. There wasn't a lot of material. And also the other outcome of this, I then, I have to get to the where I am part soon, but all the people who didn't fund me before came back and said, we'd like you to do something else with it. So the second thing that I did is, after I got so much response from, such a strong response from schools and so much from kids, that I wanted to go look at things with more complex formations of identity, as well as a whole different generation. I'd sort of looked at whiteness monolithically in Buffalo, and I wanted to look at in a city that had a different, not such a traditional black-white divide. I went to Dallas, which has this big Latino population, and how I'm interested in the relationship of how people become white and how they fit whiteness into complex identity. So on the flip side of it, it's actually a great related on Hadley, because Hadley is the polar opposite of the conversation that I had with
My identity as a person stems a lot from the queer community. I'm non-binary, neither a male or a female, and I'm pansexual and on the aromantic spectrum, and so you have that combined with a passion for the arts and humanities altogether, and I'm also just a nerd, so it's a weird concoction of interesting ideas. Being white definitely has value to me. I know that it gives me privilege. I know in a lot of sticky situations I'd be offered second chances where others wouldn't. I have a truancy case right now because I missed a lot of school, and I was the only white person in that court besides my mother, and I was also the last person to be called, so I got to watch all of the other kids go up there and the judge would be like, so why did you miss school? Why are you skipping class? Why are you doing all these bad things with bad influences around you? You need to go get a job. And then I got up there and the judge was like, oh, all right, you just need to do this. Here are these papers you're going to keep. I suggest you get a job. Have a nice day. And that was all I got. And it was weird, and a weird sort of, one of the most obvious examples I have of how I benefit from white privilege, but I know that there are a lot of little things where just people have assumptions about me based on looking at me, and my skin tone definitely goes into that.
And again, one of the things I've been really interested in is, and I think you both talked about it a bit, is this idea of how people's experience of the world is fundamentally different from the reality of the world. That the quantitative reality of the world is so different from their experience, and they're processing these narrow segments of their reality that is not reflective of what's really happening. Now, at this point, I got really nervous because all the data, again, I felt that that the data, as it started being used more and more, I really felt that in filmmaking, those of you know filmmaking, there's a lot of this, and I felt like I could make the thing much stronger if I had a real data project attached to it. And at that point, I was introduced to Peter Behrman, who runs the Interdisciplinary Center for Innovative Theory and Empirics at Insight at Columbia, and he looked at it and said, "Well, this is actually a great vehicle for doing a major study in how whiteness is constructed." And so we partnered together, and we put together a proposal to get funded. And now what we're doing is we're going out into the country, and we are doing 20 cities where we go in. Let me see if I can get this to work. Slides. So what this has become now is this has become a study where a group of sociologists go into towns, and they map the town. So we're going to be doing 20 cities over the next 3 years. And what we do is we go in and we build a map of the town, and that takes into account the churches, the businesses, the any sort of like social areas, the community centers. And what we do is then start doing surveys. And we take a representational sample of, let me see if I can get this to open up so you can go, if you go online, you can see that we try and build whole maps of communities so that when we're going in and doing our sample, we have a really representational sample of the people. And let me go back to the slides here. You can also, if you're interested in the study, you can see some of the information that we're gathering. And then we do it in the first stage. We gather a really broad-based bunch of information: job status, family structure, how often they attend church, political affiliation, questions of government. And so they sort of, the first round, I think we do about 300 to 500 people in each city, and then we gather a representational sample of 50 people from that I do in-depth oral histories with. And so, but before we do that, we then do another survey that is much more attitudinal. The agency they feel in the world, how they feel about the political parties, how they feel simply, how they feel about their church organization. And it's all sliding scale ranks. So we're really trying to build a database of people who identify as white and how they see the world. And we have these deep dive packages of information on them, both socioeconomic and attitudinal. And then they all afterwards, after we do the interview, we do another set of another survey that sees what the act of participating in it has done to their attitude. So what change takes over time, as well as, really weirdly for me, they also take a lot of data on their experience with me. So it makes me very nervous. It's like you're getting rated on how you're dressed or something. I get this data. Well, you scored a 96 with this person and an 80 on this, or whether they liked you or they loved you, you felt they trusted you. So it's been a really interesting process to go through. So we just finished in Battle Creek, Michigan, and we're now in Richmond, Virginia, and let's go back to my. And so essentially, we come in, we do the questionnaire. We're trying to build 5,000 to 10,000 national respondents we can go back to after they do this. We're now, for example, with the Battle Creek people, we've gone back and asked them to photograph objects that represent their identity, objects that represent their community, pieces of their neighborhood. And we're going to continue to sort of cultivate them to generate a big data set that will live with the Columbia University library system and be able to be accessed by any, all of our sociologists and historians going forward. And we look at it as a longitudinal study that will happen, that will be ongoing, hopefully long after I'm involved with it. So, in the pilot phase, we're in Michigan, Virginia, and then we're going to go into Wyoming. And then that's going to allow us to build a model that we can roll out nationally in the next 17 cities. Now, that's sort of where we am. And what's sort of interesting now is I realize I don't have anything to report because we just got the first batch of data in, so we haven't crushed, so there's nothing that we can actually, hopefully in a year from now, Eileen, that we'll have all the data in and we can come back and and actually explain some of the things that we learned. Also, you have to get somebody from the site because I'm actually not qualified to talk about that. So what I have learned, though, I've learned anecdotally. And I'm now a guy who's interviewed 120 people about being white. Now I'm on the way to interview 1,000 people about white. And so what have I learned? How does it relate to this conversation that we've had over the last couple of days? And I think we're at this really interesting juncture. And we're at this interesting juncture where white people are having to engage the white narrative. And I think that there's a number of things that drive it. It's almost like, I feel like we're kind of at this space where we were 10 years ago with gay marriage, when it wasn't this fully structured debate yet, but it was starting to be this moment of coming together and analyzing it, but the debate hadn't been formed yet. So when I interview people, what they're navigating is they're navigating this understanding these narratives that on some level they know to be false. That the false narrative of American exceptionalism, I believe America is an exceptional, but it's also the narrative of how we behave to our own to our own citizens, how we behave around the world. It's not an accurate narrative the way that we portray it. I think the same thing that you were talking about, Molly, this idea that how they see themselves in the world, they fundamentally know that it's actually not accurate, that they're, let's say, under attack. But as soon as you start to open up that box, it creates this huge anxiety because it's not clear where the narrative goes. If you're a black American or a gay American or a Native American, you're moving from oppression to less oppression. You're on this trajectory. If you're a white American, what's the trajectory that you're on? Like, if you believe in deconstructing white supremacy, if you believe in equality, then does that mean that I need to maintain and bring people up? How do I actually engage this? How do I engage this in my community? Is it a zero-sum game? Is it a additive game? And so what I see in these interviews all the time is this real confusion and trauma of people trying to either hold on extremely tight or to let go. And I think one of the things that I thought was really interesting is went to Charlottesville. And what really struck me with the Charlottesville images is that we've seen images for years of black people in the street fighting white agencies of power. What we have here is we have white people fighting other white people for control of the white narrative. Essentially, you have Antifa and the white nationalists are kind of similar in their worldview. They have their narrative, they're trying to, and they determine that violence is the way they need to protect it or advance it. And it's really stunning to me that they're fighting and killing each other for control of that narrative. And I think that it's really interesting to be part of the other thing, I don't know if you saw in Durham, they pulled down this statue of the protesters came and pulled down a statue of a Confederate soldier. Let's see if it will play. Please. Notice anything about that video?
They're all white.
They're all white. They're all white attacking this number. They feel somehow implicates them, and they're trying to piss themselves off. So I think that it's a really interesting and sort of astounding time to be doing this work. And I feel like I'm just at the very beginning of this project and what actually has come out of it. And within, as I said, hopefully come back next year and have some data to share with you. And I was actually thinking, how do we end? And I thought, I don't want to end on too positive a note. So this is Jason. will be plague. You know what I can do? I'm gonna go.
Do I think it's beneficial for me to be white if I got any privileges like that? I would say no. Just plan on.
Should have left long enough alone. Sorry about that. I was doing so well.
Do I think it's beneficial for me to be white if I got any privileges like that? I would say no. Just plain and simple no. I think that, with civil rights and everything, I think a lot of times that other minorities sometimes get more benefits than I would as being a white person. For some reason, some black people kind of hold on to the, back in the day, the slave thing, or they feel they're not being treated right. Should slavery be something that, because it happened, we owe black people something more? Absolutely not. Like I said, it had nothing to do with me. It had nothing to do with black people living today. Maybe their great-great-great-grandmother went through it, someone they never met, but it's in the past. There's been injustices done forever in human existence. And it's just something that shouldn't happen. But it doesn't mean I owe anyone anything because of it. I think it's hard to talk about race as a white person because I feel like maybe sometimes black people are just looking for a reason to tell you why you're wrong or tell you why you owe them something. If I was in a room full of white people, I would not feel uncomfortable talking about race. But if there were other minorities in that room, I might think a little bit different, and I might be a little bit more careful opening my mouth to not offend anyone or to potentially get in an argument or heated debate.
And why someone enter Jason? He's easy to bash, but he's asking the questions we're all asking. What do we owe black people something for history? How are we connected to history? We might come to different conclusions than him. He talks about affirmative action, and then he says, I don't know how to talk about it. I don't know how to have discussion. I'm afraid to talk about it. And so what I'm trying to create is a catalyst that people can talk about it and hopefully create some transformation change.
Thank you for the wonderful raconteur. We've had 3 marvelous presentations here. But let me tell you, I'm conscious of 3 things. I'm conscious of some of the issues that have been raised here, several of them demand serious interrogation. I'm conscious too that this is the last session of what has been a hugely stimulating couple of days here. And I would encourage people to reflect on this in the time we have available. I have negotiated a slight extension of our time. I think here is written down here to encourage you to reflect and to tie some of the issues that came up in earlier sessions to what we were discussing now. But I'm also aware that it's been a long day and it's getting dark outside. So the extension that I've negotiated with Eileen isn't infinite. Okay? Who wants to start first? Yeah, question.
Sir, you've made several references and transformative power or transformative power, and that sort of rhetoric sounded actually quite religious. And I'm wondering whether it was deliberate. You were sort of suggesting there was a kind of analogous feeling about the transformative nature of work to something sort of transformed in our relationship to Jesus. And I wonder if you can outline that, whether it's a kind of secular narrative that but is pulling very much of its kind of content and form and structure from an evangelical, much more strictly kind of Christian thing?
So to begin, I do see parallels between religious belief and belief in capitalism, historically. In much of the period I study, the belief in capitalism reflects upon actual religious belief and practice. In some cases, quite closely. the modern Pentecostalism, as we know it, emerged in this mining district in the early 20th century. I would argue because of the belief in capitalism created modern Pentecostalism, when often it's portrayed the other way around, that Pentecostalism underwrites or promotes a kind of prosperity gospel. I would argue that the prosperity gospel comes out of belief in capitalism first. But I think it's not just for the religiously inclined that relationship holds, but that it works in a more secular way. And so it's not always explicitly religious.
But it's certainly fed by that kind of culture and the narrative, or similar kind of structure of the narrative and content, just sometimes without its explicit theological.
Yes.
Molly, would you add to that?
Oh, simply that the evangelical revival is one of the great, very mutable cultural forms in American history, and you have a range of political activists from, Gene Debs to, conservative, big business libertarian types capitalizing on it as a way of galvanizing a cause. So that shows up a lot in this period.
This is for Mr. Gall's information, which is quite new to me. I wonder how this contrasts with the settlements going on of English and German who went from Pennsylvania farms west to really the very fine farming fields in Illinois and Indiana and the like. And their evangelical was, of course, practically the Lutherans with the English groups. How did that fit in? The unionization wasn't an issue. They had the Chicago trade to balance their finances. Do you see some kind of a contrast between these two, or are we going to go north after all of this?
I would say that that pattern of migration and settlement, once in Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, that they become deeply embedded in market practice, right? And they are not simply looking to establish subsistence farming, but they are farming commodities for market sale. They pin everything. Right? And when time comes, they invest in equipment, machinery, steam power when it's available, often going into debt to do so, accessing finance networks.
So it's not that different except the risk that we have.
Not that different.
Well, I'm layman in this thing, but I'm interested in finding out, now that you have mentioned each group has its own history, they also have their own narrative. The immigrant has a narrative that he can take it here. You actually describe an ideal situation in terms of these people of the world. I want to find out historically how these things have resolved themselves. The second question I have is that I'll get back to
Okay. Resolve themselves historically. Sort of,
Yes.
does the narrative play out to be true?
No. How do they? Because each group has its own narrative, and they certainly are coming or have been in conflict. How does that resolve itself?
I think in many ways it doesn't get resolved. I think we have conflicting narratives, conflicting understandings. I think Molly mentioned work on the New Deal, the emergence of American liberalism in a period of mass immigration restriction, right? Total immigration restriction in large part, is a period where, so before that, whiteness is often talked about as Americanism, right? Referencing native-born Americanism, second and third generation and older descendants of of immigrants, where new immigrants, even though they come from Europe, are considered not white. After 1924, then, particularly the 1930s and 1940s, those newer immigrant groups from Europe are merged into a new, more inclusive idea of American whiteness in the 1930s and 1940s. And I see, so we get someone like Peter in Buffalo, who the miners I'm writing about would not consider him white in 1910, right? But by this point, he considers himself part of this imagined community of American whiteness. So part of it is that actual history of social change, policy change, that brings these narratives more into alignment.
If I may, just to elaborate on that. Again, looking back, the people who are in power tend to want to use the word. But I'm thinking about the minority groups like the Jews. If they were in the majority, they would not have something. That's my own take. So this is why I'm concerned about how these issues you think as a researcher. History says it's resolved. That's the other question I had really has to do with how we interpret the religion nowadays compared with how we looked at it in the past. I think now we look at it as a social phenomenon. I'm not too sure whether we looked at it in the past as it was written by thinkers rather than people gravitate towards it because they satisfy their own sense of identity.
Who is the we in your question? When you say we today tend to view it as a social phenomenon, do you mean, are you talking about simply secularization and the rising number of people who do not subscribe to a belief in some supernatural dimension of reality?
I was talking about how we look at the influence of religion in this society. I think in the past, at least I've been told that way, the thinkers and the revolutionaries are the ones who drove everything. But nowadays, we are not talking about that. We're talking about it's springing from people's personal belief in their role in society or the group role, stuff like that, as you demonstrated.
It sounds like you're also pointing toward a turn in the way scholars track the influence of ideas. And once upon a time, the fashion was to write essentially the intellectual biographies of the great minds and almost assume the influence of those ideas. And since certainly the 1960s, there's of course been a greater burden felt by historians and people in other disciplines to try to account for the views of the non-elites. I mean, I feel this challenge very greatly as a quote-unquote intellectual historian, because it's very difficult, actually, to trace a persuasive causational line from the theological treatises and the official doctrines of churches and to certainly the ballot box, which, when journalists call me up, that's what they want to know, right? They don't care about my reflections on Wesleyan perfectionism, get to the bottom line. And, occasionally we get lucky. So, occasionally in the archives, I found a letter from the woman who was responsible for the Sunday school curricula for, 7 different denominations, writing to this theologian I was interested in, saying, I loved your book. I'm going to make sure it gets into the Sunday school classes in all of these churches. And it's like, thank you. I can sort of point to that. In other cases, we have to be more suggestive. So when I talk about the influence of that particular theological tradition, this presuppositionalism, I look very much for sort of key words, a vocabulary that I think came out of this particular home. And you can do some work with kind of tracing the intellectual training, the biographies of influential pastors and so forth, but simply looking at the way people talk can be very powerful and can give us some tools to connect this cloudland of ideas to, grassroots reality.
I checked her place in the queue, so thanks.
Thank you.
I appreciate reflections from me or all of you. Jarod introduced the idea that, some people think that these ideas that white working class rural men have is born out of ignorance or whatever, and then you've gone on to explain very articulately in detail some of the rationales for how people are thinking, and which is interesting. And I've been a labor organizer for over 40 years, and so I puzzled over this myself quite a bit. But I don't see, because of your understanding it better, does that make it? I mean, I know that miners have watched their great grandfathers and their father and the grandfathers and their fathers, and they know the history of their family dying of black lung disease in the bottom of those mines, and the fact that they'll go down swearing that this is the right thing to do. How does that make it not ignorant?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's part of the puzzle. But as a historian, what I'm interested in, how does that remain durable? Right? How do people hold that in their minds when there's abundant physical evidence? Some of it is very eloquently put. They see dying in the bed in the other room. Right?
It's a martyrdom story, though, isn't it? There's a way of understanding that it makes the narrative all the more powerful. My family has died for this, and you're telling me that this way of life is extinct? I mean, it sounds romantic and disconnected from reality, but is that?
Yeah, there's some of it, the risks, the dangers, are what make the masculinist presumptions of authority and power real. Right? Is that people die doing it. And that's what makes the courage to run the risks in the hopes of the reward so valid and heroic. So in the district I'm sitting, it's not black lung, it's silicosis. So in the 19-teens, 60% of miners in the district have silicosis. Once you get silicosis, your life expectancy is 8 to 10 years. Right? 60% of the miners. We get to 1990 when the whole thing shut down. It's an environmental disaster, the worst Superfund site in the United States. Blood tests for school children revealed 40% of school children had lead poisoning. Right? At the same time, these communities were fighting tooth and nail against the EPA for moving them out. Right? Resisting what seemed like common sense remediation efforts that mirror and very closely to similar resistance in the 19-teens against public health attempts to regulate the work to prevent silicosis. I agree with you, it's difficult to understand. But I think that we get further if we try to understand. We try to understand over time how that idea develops, but also how it remains durable and gets handed down generation to generation.
Yeah, very, very important and very
Question here.
Thank you, Jarod, Molly. I haven't read your papers. I very much look forward to your book coming out. I'm bookmarked on Amazon. As far as talk about the workers thinking of their body as capital, even buying into the fact that their body is capital. So it makes me wonder, so what's your definition of capital? Is if I was to reverse roles and be, let's say, a miner, and say, well, this is my property. My body is my property. And I'm just wondering if you came across that argumentation that they viewed their body not as capital, but that they had property in their body. And then my question to Molly is that you say that it's a selective form of libertarianism. And if you research the term libertarianism, it actually comes from the left. And there's about 6 or 8 different schisms of libertarianism, and the way that you define it as far as an action is that they wanted less government domestically, but they were very much interested in foreign intervention as far as Trump's interventions in foreign lands. So I'm kind of curious as to why that doesn't fit the definition of what's called a neoconservative.
Can I go first?
Well, I don't think that maybe I was too vague. I mean, I was using libertarian in the sort of accepted popular sense of small government focused on sort of domestic matters and regulation of the market. I don't think, and certainly I think actually Trump's isolationist rhetoric appealed a great deal to white evangelicals. I would not call his rhetoric at all traditionally neocon in sort of the Karl Rove sense, or the sense of a particular group of conservatives who had roots in the far left, but were mugged by reality, as Irving Kristol said. So I don't think we're talking at all about the same thing. Certainly, evangelicals are very susceptible to the persuasions of nationalist fervor, and the sense that America is this beacon that should spread democracy worldwide. And so, they were happy in the initial phases of the invasion of Iraq under Bush, but also just as likely, or almost as likely as most Americans, I think, to be disillusioned by that when the costs started to mount. Policy around Israel is a kind of asterisk, I suppose, and that does have something to do with evangelical belief in prophecy and the role that many of their traditions see for Middle Eastern countries in the outplay of the Book of Revelation's predictions. However, I think that tends to be exaggerated. I don't think it's as influential in the worldview of these people as it once was. So I think maybe that serves to sort of clarify what I mean by libertarian.
They thought of their bodies as capital in the sense that it was their resource that they could leverage for outsized economic gains, and they talk in this language. I don't get them saying so much to think of themselves as their own property, but they do, without batting an eye, move jobs in search of trying to negotiate higher pay, whether as strike breakers, but also between mining companies, in a way withholding labor in a way that some ways reflects labor activity, but done on an individual basis. Right? So they do feel like they pull their stake out of a mining company, which was often disastrous for these small mining companies that needed this immense labor to move or to sell. If your mining crew pulls out to go work for somebody else because they get a higher offer, that was very disruptive. But I don't see them talking about themselves as property, but definitely redeploying themselves and feeling free to move their entrepreneurial work to another location.
Owner-operator without a truck.
Yeah, just a shovel. Owner-operator with a shovel.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks a lot for your presentations. I have a question for you, Mr. Worthen. And probably this is me being in the social sciences and not history. And if you're ready to talk a little bit about the causal, the issues with causality and history, I was wondering if you can speak a little more on what I tried to figure out in your talk. What is causing what, and is in which causal relationship to what, essentially. So there are all these interesting threads on masculinity and the church being seen as kind of less masculine, for example, about racism with the segregation of the schools and intellectual traditions. And what I try to understand is what is there a main driver of this story, and then it shows up in different ways, or is it just all these things coming together and creating this phenomenon that we see? If that makes sense.
Well, the central question I'm trying to offer a partial answer to is this question of why Donald Trump has had this powerful appeal and sustained lasting appeal beyond November 8th for evangelicals, when in this superficial way it seems to not make sense. So I'm suggesting a few frameworks into which his self-presentation actually fit quite naturally. But what underlies this, what gives a certain fire and power to these these sort of theological ideas, these ways of understanding one's relationship to Christianity and a particular idea of hierarchy. I guess my first thought is simply anxiety about control over the culture and status in the culture, and the sense among white evangelicals that there was a time, and they're right about this. There was a time when America was a Protestant, was a conservative Protestant country, in terms of who controlled its key institutions, who had the power to shape the way the public school classroom functioned, who got to control public spaces, not just Christian, but Protestant. And they have seen that erode. And so this story is totally contiguous with an older story that goes back to the very first reactions against non-Protestants or non-Western Northern European immigrants. Now, I'm also presenting a history of ideas that goes back much further than that, and speaks to efforts in this tradition to hold back any perceived threat to a traditional understanding of the Bible's authority and of a kind of sense of Christendom as a reality governed by God's will and by a particular understanding of the Bible. And it turns out that longer history of managing a different set of anxieties about a different set of challenges has equipped this evangelical tradition with some powerful intellectual tools. Even if the people at a pro-life rally or a Trump rally aren't talking in these terms, don't have any clue about some of the history I've laid out, they're creatures of that history. And I think we don't understand the sort of world civilizational arc of this without going all the way back.
I'm going to pop in for just a second over to Victoria. I think the one thing that it feels like you're, well, it's avoiding is the abortion thing, right? I mean, I know a former student of mine who's a Christian, Korean Christian minister. We had a discussion after the election, and I just sort of, trying to figure out what was happening with his vote. And he said, he preaches that, Christ is a God of love and so on and so forth, and and that basically what Trump is standing for and so on. His own parents, he said, voted for Trump because how can you? You're immigrants. And they said, yeah, but he'll keep unborn babies from being killed. I mean, so anyway, so that seems to me that's really fundamental.
I'm so glad you bring that up. And I've talked to a number of evangelicals from that was very much the issue. They're single issue voters. I don't think that accounts for the entirety of the evangelical vote. However, here's what's interesting, is that before the late 1970s, abortion was not an evangelical issue, right? We have some of the most fundamentalist evangelical pastors you could find in 1973 saying the matter of abortion is a matter for the mother to decide. Sometimes there are cases where a mother's mental health should take precedence. It was considered a Catholic issue. It was something that Catholics got mobilized about, and it's in part thanks to one of the kind of culture warrior types that I referred obliquely to, a guy named Francis Schaeffer, who was a creature of this presuppositionalist tradition, who saw legal abortion as the nadir of the decline of Western civilization that represented, the collapse of the authority of the Bible in the most fundamental way. It was in part due to the work of him and activists like him that evangelicals came to view abortion not just as the murder of a fetus, but also as a symbol for this broader civilizational collapse.
And he was a filmmaker, right? Crucially?
Well, Francis Schaeffer he made two documentaries that were meant to be sort of responses to Ken Clark's Civilization series, a presentation of the decline of the West from the Christian perspective. And one he did with C. Everett Koop, Ronald Reagan's Surgeon General, and was very much focused on the abortion question, played a huge role in kind of activating evangelical audiences. So it's connected to this broader story.